our Army out of the industrial age into the 21st century, into the information age. And guess what? We are assessing and evaluating readiness today eerily similar to the way we were doing it when I came in the Army 35 years ago. And guess what? I think we can do better, right? There has to be, if not a better, certainly a more modern approach. You've heard a lot of people talk about the complexity of the time and history we find ourselves, and we're at that ubiquitous inflection point that you all hear about. Here's what I would tell you after 7 months in this job. Our Army's ready to fight today. Our Army's ready to fight and win today. But the challenge is, how do we maintain sufficient amount of readiness to meet our national defense strategy requirements? But more importantly, how do we, as we look to provide credible and capable strategic land power for large-scale ground combat operations, how do we prevent conflict, shape the environment, and win decisively in the current fight? And then the bigger question is, how do we ensure that we are ready for the future fight? And to do that, and this is something that I believe with all my heart, to do that, we have got to modernize our force, or our Army risks irrelevance. Our Army risks irrelevance if we don't get serious and execute the plan that we're on. The focus on long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicles, future vertical lift, Army network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality will go a long ways towards ensuring we maintain our competitive edge. This week you're going to hear a lot about modernization, but there is a lot more to it than new equipment. The fact is, modernization is readiness, future readiness. This week you'll hear Chief of Staff of the Army talk about strategic readiness, the ability to mobilize, deploy, and sustain our forces. FORSCOM's focus is on tactical readiness, and that is how we man, train, equip our forces so that they can quickly mobilize, deploy, fight, and win. While we build and sustain readiness, we have to consider impacts to the Army total force when it comes to modernization. Under sustainable readiness, any unit, regardless of level of modernization, can and should be prepared to deploy. And that means that our least modern formations must be interoperable with our most modern formations. We're working with all of the Army commands to ensure our efforts to modernize are synchronized throughout the Army while sustaining readiness, and this may require iterative shifts in emphasis between readiness and modernization. You know, there is a discussion right now as we look at the Army's campaign plan, and some of you have asked this question, what does it mean to shift from readiness to modernization? Well, I just laid out for you the Secretary of the Army's priorities, right? And the first one was readiness. But we are going to have to nuance our way through our modernization efforts, and there may be days in the future where we wake up and the priority for that day may be modernization vice readiness. And we need to be agile enough to do that. So we're never, ever, ever going to back off of readiness. And we're always going to be ready to meet our nation's requirements. But we do need to ensure that our modernization efforts are synchronized and nested with our ability to sustain tactical readiness and maintain our ability to quickly deploy, fight, and win. So again, before I pass the microphone over to our panel members, I'd like to once again thank each of you for taking time out of your day to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to having a great discussion. Thank you all very, very much.
Well, thanks, General Garrett, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel with these distinguished panelists who I have great respect for. This is a super important discussion. From my position outside the Army, I have watched with admiration as the Army has essentially climbed out of a readiness ditch, if you will, to improve the readiness of its BCT, starting around 2015 to the point where in March of this year, General Milley reported that over half of the Army's BCTs have reached the top levels of readiness. It's a huge improvement. And as we report in this document, which I'm shamelessly promoting, the Heritage Index of U.S. military strength, available in booth 7868, this is a real reflection, and there aren't many, honestly, of the increased funding that this administration has put against defense in the last 2 years. It is also reflective of the huge importance and the emphasis that Army leaders have put on readiness since 2015. It's captured best by General Milley when he says, and if you haven't heard this 100 times, then you're not in the Army, readiness is the #1 priority, and there is no other #1. The Army should be very proud of this achievement and where they've gotten to today. Having said that, I will offer that I believe the word readiness is one of the most overused and least understood words in the Army and probably in the entire U.S. military. It can be and is used for justification for any number of programs, from tank ammunition to swimming pools. And when people say readiness, that's not enough. You got to ask them, what do they really mean? You can never be completely sure what they're talking about. When you go to a meeting about readiness, you don't know what to prepare for because there are so many different varieties of readiness. And so we have invented essentially a number of different modifiers to discuss what the heck we're talking about. So as General Garrett mentioned, you'll hear the words tactical readiness. You'll also hear individual readiness. You'll hear unit readiness to talk about the hard readiness of our units and soldiers. And these types of measures of readiness are typically graded against solid metrics like equipment on hand, tasks trained to standard, or personnel availability. As we have seen, this type of readiness responds very well to increased money, increased attention, and increased time. In a book that I'll refer to several times, Military Readiness, by a guy named Dr. Richard Betts, which I recommend this book if you've not seen it, he refers to this type of readiness as operational readiness. And this is that area in which the Army has made dramatic progress. You'll also hear the word, and I think General Garrett just mentioned it, future readiness. And you leaders use this word to justify the importance of investment in Army modernization, and they're not wrong, but they are trying to get on the readiness bandwagon, essentially. And you can have formations with all the required equipment, it's well maintained, all the people you need, and they can be slaughtered by an opponent that has more modern equipment. And so I think probably the Polish horse cavalry units at the start of World War II were probably impeccably maintained and manned and had all the horses they were supposed to have, and German armor units slaughtered them. In July of 2014, the Army published Army Regulation 52530, titled Strategic Readiness, in an effort to capture a broader aspect of readiness. And the Army defines strategic readiness as the readiness of the Army as an institution to provide sufficient, capable units to support the national military strategy. Strategic readiness seeks to evaluate areas not considered in operational readiness, such as the generating force, the capacity or the size of the Army versus the anticipated needs, installations and mobilization platforms, war reserve stocks, and the ability to deploy Army forces. Professor Betts, who wrote that book, also recognizes this need for a more holistic type of readiness definition. He calls it structural readiness, but they're really both getting at the same kind of thing. Betts talks about structural readiness as how soon a force of the size necessary to deal with the enemy can be available. Whatever you call it, structural readiness, strategic readiness, these are much more difficult questions, a more wicked problem than measuring operational readiness, but at least as important. Questions of strategic readiness would include how large an Army do we need, of what type units, how quickly deployable, and with what stocks of ammunition and spare parts, and how quickly do we need to mobilize those parts of the Army that are not ready. Recalling my days on the Army staff, we had a very difficult time coming up with any sort of definite requirement for the number and type of units that would be required to mobilize. I remember we were talking about World War II barracks, I think it was at Fort Stewart at the time, and we knew that they had proven useful in the past to mobilize Army units that were coming in, but we had no idea how much barracks capacity we needed, So could we destroy these old barracks and save the maintenance costs, or did we need to keep them for some sort of eventuality? We just had no way of knowing at the time. Considerations of strategic readiness will also cause questions to be asked about whether it's preferable to have a larger army with a lower level of readiness or a smaller army with a very high level of readiness. Well, the normal response, at least when I was in the Army, is we want as much readiness as we can get, don't we? But that may not be the right answer. A strategic readiness system would cause you to ask whether it makes sense to maintain the number of BCTs in a high state of readiness, even if Transcom, Transportation Command, can't get them anywhere in any reasonable amount of time. And so you may have a ton of ready BCTs and no way to get them across the ocean. And you would ask yourselves, does that make sense? Or would you be better off taking that money and the time spent to maintain these units and apply it to another Army priority like modernization or installations? I remember when I was working in Army G8 and overseeing the programming for missile launchers. I think it was Patriot, but it could have been something else. And I realized there was no real benefit, at least in the readiness system, to buying missiles. You get a benefit for buying the launcher, but there was nowhere in our Army readiness system where we tracked how many missiles did we have on hand. And so I remember vividly, frankly, General Corelli getting all upset when he found out we had bought a bunch, or were planning to buy a bunch of launchers and just 1 or 2 missiles, and we would count on OCO funds to buy the missiles that we needed. He didn't think that was a wise strategy for some reason. A strategic readiness system would have highlighted that kind of a problem. There are typically hidden and under-discussed consequences for an Army to maintain a level of tactical readiness higher than what is needed. In a world of finite resources, every dollar spent maintaining a unit in a high level of readiness above what is needed to execute the national defense strategy is a dollar that could be spent modernizing the force, fixing an installation, recruiting or retaining a soldier, or sending a soldier to school. To maintain a high level of readiness not needed by the strategy can stress soldiers and puts miles on Army vehicles and hours on Army aircraft, more quickly taking them to the end of their life cycles. So how do we get this right? Professor Betts suggests that 3 questions must be answered. The first is determine the readiness for when. How quickly are ready units needed for the strategy? You need to understand whether, how, and when an adversary will go to war. And this answers the question, at what time frame do Army forces need to be ready? The second question is readiness for what? What type of war do we anticipate? What type of adversary should we prepare to fight? Under what conditions? Answers the question what and how much Army capability is needed. My research, again, available at our booth, suggests that the regular Army is too small for the near-peer strategy that's contemplated in our national defense strategy. And then finally, the third question is readiness of what? What forces should be made ready first? How should they be sequenced? And this helps answer the question of priorities and resources. General Garrett alluded to this, but the current published Army strategy reflects that the Army is focusing on readiness now through 2022, and then the Army priority will shift to modernization as a new generation starts to arrive in the force. It may be instead that readiness, in all of its forms, future, strategic, operational, needs to operate in parallel with modernization versus a shift in priority. That type of sequential thinking has gotten us into trouble with both cases, with modernization when we take modernization holidays and also when we have taken readiness holidays. I also believe we need to do a better job with our terminology, establish firm definitions, train our officers and non-commissioned officers how to think about readiness in a more sophisticated way. And as we focus on near-peer competition, we're going to have better terms and better systems to manage the risk and the force. I'll close my remarks by congratulating the Army on the vastly increased levels of tactical readiness they have achieved and looking forward to the future successes of the Army. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So good afternoon, and thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to AUSA and ILW for hosting the panel, to General Garrett for inviting me to speak, and to my fellow panel members for their thoughts today and for their careers' worth of contributions and service. From General Spohr, you heard today about readiness from a variety of perspectives and his thoughts on Richard Betts's three questions of readiness for what, readiness for when, and readiness with what. And as was often the case in my career, having worked for him several times, General Spohr has shaped a profoundly important discussion about which I get the opportunity to provide additional context and depth. He talked a lot about what we need to measure, and I specifically want to talk more about how we measure readiness. Without understanding what we can or do measure about readiness and what we can't or don't measure about readiness, we're challenged to know if we have enough or if we have it in the right ways. Over the course of my various research projects involving the measurement of readiness, I've come to believe that we must do so at four distinctly levels of analysis, which in many ways track with the distinctions both General Spohr and Richard Betts have highlighted. I would suggest that at each level we must have a different way of measuring readiness. The levels will interrelate, and we need to understand those relationships and dependencies, but each is still a fundamentally different measurement. At the highest level, the strategic level, we want to know whether or not the force, as it is today and as we've programmed it for tomorrow, can execute the demands of the National Defense Strategy, the Defense Planning Guidance, or whatever the document du jour is for establishing the guidance for what the joint force must be prepared to execute. These types of measurements are characterized by tremendous uncertainty. Who will we fight, when, and for what goals? As chairman, General Dempsey was famous for noting that we have a 100% wrong record of predicting these fights. In some cases, we got the technology and doctrine right, but we got the foe wrong, as when we went to war with Iraq in 1991. In some cases, we had the wrong focus, technologically and doctrinally, as when we began the hard process of relearning stability operations in both Afghanistan and Iraq. The Department of Defense's analytic agenda or support to strategic analysis processes are supposed to help with these types of measurements, and in some ways they do. However, they have significant shortfalls too. The SSA process, with its integrated security constructs, numbered scenarios, and a set of vignettes, does provide some measure of breadth in analysis, a breadth that is designed to make sure we are looking at a range of possible futures and not betting everything on a single future coming to pass. Similarly, the campaign analysis done at COCOMs and in the Joint Staff provide additional touch points for understanding how or how well the current or programmed force will perform against a range of threats. However, I firmly believe that the outcome of much of this analysis is precisely wrong answers which do little to help senior decision makers understand risk, resource trades, or readiness. In large part, I believe it is because the modeling is so overdetermined that it can't serve as an effective learning or investigative tool, nor can it provide meaningful options for the department to choose from. Methods for robust decision-making or decision-making under uncertainty are available and I believe should be used more often. These methodologies expand the portfolio analysis of the SSA manyfold and provide a much more robust picture of the range of potential demands that could be placed on the joint force. This, in turn, provides a much richer data set to inform the question of readiness with what. The second level of analysis for readiness is at the operational level. This is the level that the Defense Readiness Reporting System, or DRRS, was meant to help illuminate. In DRRS, each COCOM assessed their ability to meet a range of O plans and CON plans, and DRRS represents a great leap forward in readiness analysis, but it too has much room for improvement. Unit reporting in DRRS is based on a set of METAL tasks that provide little information about the conditions under which those tasks were trained. Thus, for example, an Air Force squadron in DRRS might show itself as trained in providing close air support, but it won't be clear to the COCOM whether that training reflects the operational realities of CAS in Afghanistan or the operational realities of providing CAS through a Russian integrated air defense system. The unit is ready, but ready for what? And given the Army decision to have standardized metals, the breadth of tasks available to COCOMs can be constrained. In this area, we have to ask ourselves, do we have the right distribution of metal tasks trained across the force? Or as I discussed with General Cavoli earlier today, are we training the metals under the right distribution of conditions? And how much risk is there in having the distribution wrong? But the right distribution must be a time, risk, and resource-based discussion. How much time and which resources do I need to shift that distribution to meet the unexpected or the non-prioritized event? Second, units don't operate by themselves, and the unit-based system from which DRRS information is drawn does not necessarily indicate whether or not the unit is trained to operate in a task organization under which it will be expected to fight. We tend to be well-practiced at operating with U.S. Army task organizations. For our priority fights, however, it will be imperative that we can operate within joint and multinational task organizations at a variety of levels and with a variety of command and support relationships. Our ability to do so is poorly measured and poorly understood. Finally, at the operational level, regional COCOMs are completely dependent on the ability of the functional COCOMs, most immediately TRANSCOM, but also SOCOM, STRATCOM, and increasingly now CYBERCOM. Equally important are the contributions of defense agencies like the Defense Logistics and the Defense Health Agencies. We may be able to give these commands and agencies effective guidance on what to be ready for, with what, and when, but until we have better metrics of their readiness to do so and of the risks involved at each readiness level, we don't really know how ready we are. This talks to General Spore's comments about buying the launchers, but not the missiles. Are you ready? The third level of analysis is the one with which most of us are most familiar, unit level readiness. This is a measurement of whether a unit is trained and resourced to conduct a set of metal tasks, or, if already assigned a specific mission, to execute those mission-directed tasks. In this area, the Army has been making some very good progress towards improving the measurement of readiness. Over the last several years, the Army has introduced Objective T to better measure training outcomes. It has started to develop metrics and a tracking system for measuring interoperability. It has started to look at how you measure outcomes in tasks like building partner capacity. Each of these will better inform the Army as to how to build and measure readiness in units and where the resource strategy is working and where it isn't. The biggest challenge, however, with unit level readiness is at the seam between the unit and the operational levels. As I mentioned above, the distribution of units by task but also by readiness levels should be a deliberate set of choices informed by time and resource requirements and by risk tolerance. Readiness is characterized by entropy. Left alone, it will decay. The Army has long understood this and has always had some version of cyclic readiness and some version of tiered readiness. The names and program elements change, but the Army isn't, nor should it strive to be, capable of keeping the entire force at a high level of readiness at all times. In fact, it is important to keep in mind that the Army has always chosen, even during the height of the surge in Iraq, to be overstructured. What this means is that the Army has always shown a preference for accepting an Army that can't possibly be ready across all of the dimensions and instead relies on moving resources to build readiness as needed. Whether you call it an ALO Army or tiered readiness or ARFRGen or SRM, this preference for overstructure is baked into our DNA, and at some point we need to do a better job of embracing it and managing it rather than lamenting it. What is missing then from unit readiness measurement is a clear set of guideposts on what is the necessary distribution to mitigate risk or respond to COCOM needs. The guideposts should be informed first and foremost by COCOM demands and campaign timelines, but also by training levels and their rates of change, of mobilization capacity and its elasticity, transportation capacity and its elasticity, and by risk guidance and hedging options. Today's sustainable readiness model is a good first approximation of this, and truth be told, a careful and detailed measurement may not be feasible. Still, further grounding SRM goals in unit readiness funding and solid analytics that include these factors is important. The final level of analysis is in many ways the hardest one and the easiest one. For units to build readiness, we know that they need people with the right mix of skills and experience, equipment as dictated by both their MTO and by mission-specific demands when known or knowable, and that the equipment must work, which implies a certain availability of spare parts. But at the highest level, these three deliverables, people, equipment, and parts, rely on systems that stretch far beyond the unit itself. I won't go into a lot of detail about those systems except to say that we need better ways of tracking how they, or where they, incorporate unit-level resourcing as their ultimate output metric. As for unit-level resourcing, it is possible that at one point we understood why we set readiness reporting standards for these resources the way we did. Was there science behind the decision that the breakpoint between level 1 and level 2 is the difference between 90% or more personnel available and not 89% or 92%? In every resource area, we have these breakpoints that enable us to take what is essentially a continuous function, where more is always better, and report it as a step function, where only 4 thresholds matter. And a lot of movement can happen and a lot of resources can be expended without ever having the unit or resource area cross to the next threshold. I'm not sure that there's an effective way to report readiness as a continuous function that it really is, and I'm not sure that we understand why we chose the thresholds we chose. And I'm not sure that we understand, at more than an intuitive level, how different levels for equipment on hand, equipment readiness, personnel, and training really interact to create an overall C-level or unit readiness level. I suspect we could do a better job of doing so. I'm not yet convinced that doing a better job is necessary, as long as we understand the limits of what our commander's USR is really telling us. I'm not sure if you'll take my thoughts today as a good news story or as a bad news story. I don't really believe it's either. The DoD and the Army continuously have been improving the ways in which they measure readiness across all 4 levels I've discussed. Researchers like General Spohr and myself, and policymakers like Generals Garrett and Cavoli and Flynn will always want to find ways to do better. If I had to summarize my advice to them and to the Army and DoD as succinctly as possible, I would offer these few thoughts. First, readiness will always be a function of time, so in everything you measure, make sure you understand how time affects it. Ready enough today may be good enough for next week's demand, but not for tomorrow's. Find ways to incorporate rates of change into readiness reporting. Second, this impact of time means that the most readiness resourcing decisions are about distributions of readiness to be achieved. Be clear about what the distribution is that's necessary to allow time, given your resources, to produce the readiness required. Third, readiness is a continuous function, not a step function. So use the sea-level reporting as a first step in analysis, not as the last step. And finally, risk is the inverse of readiness. Readiness must always be considered with risk guidance and tolerances in mind. More is good, but it's not always necessary. And resources saved from current unit readiness may be what are needed to affect the mobilization, transportation, leader development, and modernization demands of the Army. The challenge is to trust your yardstick enough to know when you've gotten where you need to go. Thanks again to ILW, to AUSA, to General Garrett, and to my fellow panel members. It's been a great honor. Thank you.
General Garrett, thanks for having us here today, and to Tom and Mike, appreciate the comments made. Two things that I'll start with. First of all, 2 good things. One, everything that Tom and Mike just described, we are working on helping us measure all the things that Mike and Tom discussed here about measuring readiness, and I'll get into that in a little bit. The second thing is we do know where the missiles are, and we have them, and there's plenty of them. So we've fixed that to date. Believe me, I'm spending a lot of time on missiles every day. So I think the fundamental challenge that we're faced with, as kind of outlined here, is that maintaining the readiness that we've gained and the readiness initiatives, while at the same time modernizing the force, bringing new capabilities into new formations, and having to balance that with potentially flat resources. So I'll come back to that at the end, because I think that's the fundamental challenge that we're faced with today. A lot of discussion here this morning, and I don't have to tell this group, but the Army in the last 2 decades have been laser focused, and in the last, really, I would say 5 to 7 years on building unit readiness. And some of those discussions were pointed out here. But they were done in the context of no clear peer adversary, an enormous demand on the force over the last 2 decades specifically, and that demand continues today. There were tactical challenges that were confronted and could be confronted by the brigade combat teams. I don't want anyone to forget that that was really between about 2006 and 2009 was when we ended up converting all the brigades from the Army of Excellence to the Army to the modular force. So we haven't really been doing it for just over a decade or so. And then, arguably, we've had a singular focus in the Middle East. Okay, break. From that, really in the last 18 months, we have for the first time in quite a while, a coherent and consistent set of strategic documents. The National Security Strategy, the National Military Strategy, the Defense Planning Guidance, the Army Strategy and the Army Vision, and we're in the throes of making the Army Campaign Plan great again to make sure that we have some rigor in how we actually see ourselves. And so, in those documents, they're really describing what at least the next decade and beyond look like with great power competition, global simultaneity, the ability to generate forces through the global operating model into priority regions using dynamic force employment, trying to be strategically predictable to our allies and partners while being tactically unpredictable to what our adversaries see. And then, of course, our concept in the Army, because we see that we have some gaps through analysis in large-scale combat operations, and the way we're going to fix that is addressing some of those gaps, and that gap analysis feeds into our operational concept of multi-domain operations. Again, the Army has made enormous gains at the brigade level, and a lot of, even here and throughout the crowd, a lot of discussion is at the brigade combat team level. And there's no doubt that the Army in the last really 5 years has increased nearly 50% better ratings by those brigade combat teams. But the Army is more than brigade combat teams. The Army needs those functional and multifunctional brigades, and they need the C2 headquarters to be able to control those functions once they're employed. And those enabling capabilities largely are the things that the Joint Force needs, and they need them all the time, as is needed today. So that brings me to strategic readiness. So we are doing some work, relooking at, as mentioned earlier by Tom Sporer, Army Regulation 525-30, which is about strategic readiness. We have really good models on C1, C2, C3, C4 for unit readiness. We need to dig in a little bit on force projection readiness, and those two gears really additive create strategic readiness. And we need to look at this because the demand is not going to decrease. I mean, we have nearly 175,000 U.S. Army soldiers deployed in about 140 countries today. That demand's not coming down, at least for the foreseeable future that I see. So we're going to have to balance what we have achieved in readiness and at the same time try to take the appropriate resources matched up against the priorities that the Army senior leaders have laid out and try to develop and introduce and provide increased capabilities to increase lethality to the formations and do that in a timely manner beginning now. The global operating model and dynamic force employment that I mentioned earlier, this is a new way that the Joint Force is going to both measure our readiness, put demands on the force, and then use that readiness so we can provide it to commanders like General Cavoli and other GCC or other theater Army commanders that need to put those forces into their theaters in the contact layer so they can compete against their adversaries. We're going to need to do this because we recognize that having access and having presence and having influence with our allies and partners out there is enormously important. We're not going to do this alone. We have to do it with those relationships that we're building across the globe. We have to maintain those relationships by having those formations forward in the contact layer, operating every day so we can increase our interoperability and really build the readiness that we need at the tactical level to solve operational and strategic problems. The Defender series that we have coming up is an example of that. And we're going to do this every year. This year is weighted into Europe. And Chris Cavoli here is going to take an enormous amount of formations right out of the continental United States, integrate them with his allies through the NATO relationships, and then integrate them with the forces that he has assigned on the continent of Europe. We're going to do it 4 months later out to the Pacific. Not quite as big into Europe, but the plan is to use this Defender series to bring joint capabilities together, the bulk of that being Army land component capabilities, so we can exercise all these strategic readiness challenges that we're confronted with: mobilization, deployment, employment, sustainment, and then redeployment. Those things have to happen. Those RSO&I tasks that have to happen. In many ways, what we've been doing for a number of years is going from the known to the known. And what we need to begin to operate and begin to test ourselves and stress ourselves is going from the unknown to the unknown. And that's where this Defender series, through EDRES and dynamic force employment, is going to begin to test some of these systems that need to get stressed, and they need to be measured so that we get an idea of how we actually see ourselves by way of strategic readiness. The last thing I'd say is there's a number of training initiatives that are going on at the lower level. I think most of you understand we've extended some of the basic training for a number of our MOSs. We have built new formations already. We have I2Qs. The Secretary talked about it this morning. We're building multi-domain task forces. We have SFABs that are being built. There's an SFAC over the top of that, a recognition that we're not walking away from the things that we've learned in the last 2 decades. And then, of course, all the 31 programs and the 6 priorities that Army Futures Command is working on, from the synthetic training environment to hypersonics to everything in between. So getting the force to the point where it can receive those new capabilities and maintain its readiness is paramount for the Army senior leaders. And again, I'll just close on the fundamental challenge we're faced with is maintaining this readiness and the initiatives associated with this while modernizing the force and doing it with a leveled off level of resources. So I look forward to your questions. I'm thankful for the thoughts that both Tom and Mike offered here. I'm sure Chris has some things that commanders make the G3 think about all the time, but we're looking forward to your questions too. Thanks very much for your time.
Sir. So the amazing thing about following panelists as qualified as Tom and Mike and Charlie is they have literally said everything I was going to say. But that will not stop me. They did cause me to think of other things. Charlie talked about going from the unknown to the unknown, which is a very succinct description of the land navigation course at Ranger School for Lieutenant Cavoli in 1988. So let's try to do better than that, although they let me get through eventually. So all of this comes together sort of at the theater Army level, right? So we employ the force, for the most part, in theaters run by geographic combatant commanders, and in each of those we have an Army headquarters. And that's my job in Europe. And as such, I own both sides of the equation. We have an assigned force and we have a theater set, and I'm required to keep those ready. So as General Garrett pointed out a minute ago, USER is a provider. Any theater army is a provider of readiness, but is also ultimately the consumer of readiness. We're both a force generator and a force employer. This means we have to both keep people ready to fight, but we also have to keep our force ready to receive strategic level reinforcements. And so this is really what defines our activity in U.S. Army Europe. And I'd like to speak just for a moment because, honestly, most of the great points I thought I had have already been said better and more eloquently by my colleagues here. However, this idea of echelons of readiness is absolutely critical from a theater Army perspective. It is not good enough for me to try to go to sleep at night knowing that we have ready brigades. They have to be ready brigades that are employable in a ready operational construct with ready strategic backbone to reinforce them. And so we are concerned in any theater Army with all 3 echelons of readiness, and pretty much from my perspective as the commander in reverse order: strategic readiness, and then operational readiness, and then tactical readiness. So strategic readiness consists of the set of the theater, its preparation, its understanding, and its ability to receive a reinforcement and employ it. Secondly, at the operational echelon, the ability to command and control large-scale ground combat operations and to sustain them over time in a sustained land campaign as part of a joint fight. That sounds like something out of our textbooks, but that is an amazing thing when you contemplate it as compared to the way we have been operating. So I very much applaud the focus that the Army has been putting on operational and strategic level readiness in the last couple of years. At the tactical level, theater readiness really focuses on the conditions. I was speaking with Mike about this a little earlier, but it's the conditions almost as much as the tasks that drive our understanding of whether a unit is ready. For instance, the conditions in Europe involve terrain and vegetation and weather that is specific to the operational area. I see my colleagues here, the Land Forces Chief General Kurlins from Latvia, Raimundas Vaitsnoras, the Land Forces Chief from Lithuania. I thought Petri Hulko back there from Finland. Believe me, their countries do not look like the National Training Center. The terrain and the vegetation and the weather are not the same. So there is a certain specificity that we have to achieve really to be ready at the tactical level. And then at all three echelons, we really have to be careful to do what two of my colleagues talked about, which is to operate with our allies. It is not good enough to be an excellent force that has to operate in isolation. We have to be an excellent force that can operate in other places with those forces. In some cases, they're allies. In some cases, they're close friends. In some cases, they're temporary partners. But in any event, our ability to incorporate those forces and to complement their operations is fundamental to our prospects for success. And as Mike pointed out, this is something that we have struggled over the years to measure, and this level of interoperability is something that we have to work on every day. Finally, as Charlie pointed out a couple of minutes ago, we have the Defender series. Most of the things I just talked about are physical realities, right? The realities of the terrain, the realities of the time-distance factors, the realities of putting brigade after brigade through a single port, the realities of the concrete composition of railheads in Eastern Europe. These are physical realities. The only way we can really find where we are not ready in terms of these physical realities is by doing. And in this regard, the U.S. Army is leading the way with the Defender series of exercises, which will practice strategic, operational, and tactical readiness simultaneously at scale across global distances. So with that, I'll pause, and I look forward to the discussion.
Gentlemen, thank you for your comments. General Spohr, I think you were right on the term readiness. We just had about a 30-minute conversation on the multiple facets of readiness. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll play the traffic cop. I'm Colonel Chris Black from FORSCOM on the Q&A session. As you can see right there in the audience, you have 4 different microphones. So we ask that you go ahead and come on up to the microphones, and I'll sequence you in to have a more robust conversation on readiness with the esteemed panel members. I ask that we only ask one question at a time, if possible. I know sometimes that's hard. And then just please state kind of who you are, where you're from, and who you work for. So with that, ma'am, go to you.
Okay. I'm Rania Azmi. I'm running the Association of the U.S. Army Overseas Chapter in Kuwait. My profession, I'm an expert in decision-making by qualification, and I do some volunteer work for cancer patients. So that's the 3 things. My question would be as interesting as my background. So the first part is you cannot manage what you cannot measure, but at the same time, we recognize that past is singular and the future is by definition assured to be multiple. So what would be the question back to the panel? What would be the gap between your research and development in measuring readiness and the reality? If we have multiple futures, which distribution would you take? In the financial world, they say there is black swan and there's black elephant in how catastrophic events could happen. So how you make sense of that? And very quickly, I'm a very big fan and advocate of social infrastructure. So you have systems and everything, but what you do for the soldiers for them, managing their time, I think managing their energy is more important than managing their time to have more productivity, and that's related to health. So thank you.
Managing their energy, that is a wonderful euphemism. Excellent.
I'll jump in just real quickly first by saying I did talk a little bit about these concepts of decision-making under uncertainty or robust decision-making, which are sort of portfolio-based approaches. And the trick for that is that you have to be able to build up a large enough portfolio to really understand where the trade space is. But the concept behind it is that you're willing to suboptimize against a particular outcome as a hedge against possible outcomes, which is very different than the way we used to do threat-based planning, which is if I'm ready for the Soviets, everything else is lesser included. I've made that decision, I'll be ready for them, and if anything else comes up, my assumption going in, which I can validate with some amount of testing, is that I'd be ready for that other threat at some acceptable level of risk, maybe not optimized for it. We're coming back into that sort of a system with some of the priorities that we've been given within our defense strategic guidance about how against what threats we want to measure what types of readiness. So the trick is to understand, A, are we ready for the directed scenarios, and then B, what might readiness there cost us against the unexpected, and do we want to hedge or not? And that's where this expanded portfolio analysis comes in. But that's at the strategic level. I'm going to sort of lay off on the other levels for right now and let my colleagues speak.
I would just say, we used to talk about most dangerous course of action or the most likely course of action. I think as we should run these scenarios against, a hybrid of those kinds of things. What's most dangerous for the Army? Obviously, we want to be able to be prepared against that. But we cannot, as Mike has kind of alluded to, ignore the most likely, which is probably not near-peer, large-scale conventional ground operations. So we need to be thinking about that as well. And so it's, I talk about in some of the research I've done how this is a much more complex area. We have never, since maybe 1935 or so, had to prepare for two near-peers. We've always had the luxury to think about one. And now we're in this area where we're having to think about two. It's hard to prepare concepts. It's hard to think about plans when you have two near-peer threats, but that's just where the Army's going to have to go, and I make no illusion that it's going to be easy.
And to build off what Tom said, it's even within a given theater, it's not easy now, and it's important not to reach back too much to the past for models. In many ways, the Cold War was a very, very easy construct for us. We had, for the U.S. Army, there was a requirement to defend in one country against a known enemy force at a known location at an unknown time. Now those are all unknowns, right? Unknown contingency, unknown force, unknown time, unknown location, and frankly, unknown area of operation within the larger European theater. So it's very important to try to measure what we do know, but understand what we don't know about what we're trying to get done.
I would just say, so we've been told to do what I call 4 Ds: defeat, deter, disrupt, and defend. So we know that. And I think there's some pretty good war games that are going on in the future, take into account many of the things that Chris just talked about. And then I think there's some really good work going on by the combatant commanders on their plans. So I think there's some intellectual rigor that's happening where there's less clarity in the future, but at least there's some scenario-driven war games that are giving us some idea of what things might be. And then there are the knowns of, hey, we have to have X force at Y location with Z capabilities to do the following things. And I think the real PhD level work here is kind of matching those two to make sure that we're looking at the right things. In some ways, seeing ourselves is more important than seeing the adversary. Knowing what we have, what we don't have, where it is, how quickly it can get there or how slowly, how much lift it needs to do that is more important than necessarily knowing exactly where the enemy's formation is at exact times.
Yep, and of course, talking about complexity, sir, we also added 2 more domains in the last few years that add to it. So, sir, please.
Hi, Dave Gerstenlauer. I'm with National Guard Bureau J55. I'm a contractor. I don't speak for NGB, but I'm a retired Army, so I've had 30 years of experience there and 14 more as a contractor in strategic planning and domestic planning. My question is really to any one of the panel members, anyone who wants to answer this, but You talked about the global operating model, dynamic force employment. I assume that leads into the global integrated exercises. You talked about EDREs and DFEs, working on that, and the allies and partners could be incorporated into all of those things. But my question is more about simultaneity. You talked about the Defender series being Europe, then Pacific. Someone once said there are no priorities amongst essentials. What is the Army thinking in an unclassified way about homeland defense? Because of the global operating model, we need to remember that the homeland is not a sanctuary anymore. So what does the Army see from the perspective of, no, we don't necessarily have a vision of land forces, but what about the Army's missile defense or space, cyber, whatever else?
I'll take a stab. So defend the homeland is arguably the most important mission we have of those 4 Ds. Obviously, there are threats that we're going to have to, confront outside of the United States. But I think when I made the comment about going from the unknown to the unknown, that unknown is brought to us by adversaries that are going to disrupt our ability to actually move. And so terminals, ports, airfields, railheads, sea terminals, those things are all on the commercial market. They're all run by some form, either private or public partnership. But we are going to have to rely on those to be able to project force. So we have to work with local, state, and federal level officials to make sure that we've got some synergy and some coordination between all the layers that are going to participate in the Homeland Defense mission. So to your question, we take it very seriously, and part of being able to project the forces into the Pacific and Europe is to actually exercise some of those things going on in the homeland so that we can, again, see ourselves and our ability to project that power. And the best feedback we're going to get is from units, commanders at the local level, and using terminals and ports that we're going to share with our local communities and work together to make sure that we overcome some of those obstacles that we know are going to be that are going to confront us. Cyber is an easy one. That will happen.
Good morning, gentlemen. Colonel Halleck with the Military Intelligence Readiness Command at Fort Belvoir. Can you speak to readiness in the reserves and how we're planning? You speak of a million, person army, but a lot of it's made up of reserves and the Guard, and we don't participate every day, but we have like the civil affairs. Most of that's in our backyard. How do you plan on readiness for the reserves? If you could speak to that, gentlemen, thanks.
That's a great question, and I asked Charlie if I could answer it first, because in my tactical operational strategic construct, I neglected, because I wasn't wearing these awesome looking glasses, I neglected to talk about all 3 compos, right? So Chip Lucky's back there waving his hand. Mike Harvey, stand up for a sec there. Yeah. Mike Harvey commands our reserve command in Europe. Joe Girard's back there, Major General Girard's our Deputy Commanding General for Army National Guard. Everything I talked about at the tactical level and at the operational level and at the strategic level requires all 3 compos for our operations inside Europe. And therefore, readiness at all 3 of those echelons indeed becomes a strategic thing in and of itself when we talk about strategic readiness. So we try to exercise it a lot. Defender 20 will certainly exercise it at scale. And with that, I'll pause and turn over to Charlie.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First of all, we've got to be very recognize the cyclic nature by which the Guard and Reserve have to be able to participate. But candidly, I think getting these exercises on a calendar so that there's some predictability in the capability to be generated. And as you pointed out, rightfully so, there's a number of enabling capabilities that are very early on needed in the war plan in any theater. So part of the idea with the Defender series is to look for those capabilities that are going to be early deployers, time it so that your cycle enables you or allows you to participate in it, and then go over and do those things that Chris was describing, where you're actually exercising like how we actually do this. And so we're going to need your feedback as well in both Compo 2 and 3 to say what's the best fit for that. And coming back, in fact, I see Tom James sitting here up front to the previous question. There's a whole nother host of things that are going to happen in the homeland with the Guard and Reserve that are going to be complementary to what we're doing, but it's also going to be challenging to what we're doing. So I actually think that, again, back to seeing ourselves through this process, I think that's going to be the most important thing that we've gained from it.
I'll just add a critical part. I mean, if you've ever bought insurance, you get this pitch about whole life and term and something like that, and they talk about, you don't want an entire insurance portfolio of whole life because it's super costly, and that's kind of regular Army. I mean, it's the platinum policy. You're paying a lot. You're getting a high level of coverage. The reserve components provide this ability for this balanced portfolio of capabilities. You will hear a lot about, hey, there's this reserve component unit is in the early deployer stack or force package, and sometimes that is required. I mean, so there are some units which are better suited for reserve component type function, like civil affairs comes to mind. But that should not be the normal course of actions. We should have a portfolio where the reserve components do not have this early requirement, because that is just not a natural state of affairs to be extraordinarily highly ready and to be in the reserve component. So I think in some cases, I'm speaking out of school because I'm not in the school anymore. We need to kind of even that out and make sure that we have got the right capabilities and the right components, and that for the most part, early deploying capabilities are contained in the regular Army, and except when there's a unique capability that is best suited to be cited in the reserve components.
So as long as we're talking out of school, I'll pitch in a little bit too. So, I talked, in my 4 sort of notes at the end about how you have to include the word time in everything you do when it comes to readiness. And the reserve component is one of those classic situations where if I have the time to get them ready, then they're actually the force of choice in a lot of cases, as opposed to an active component 1. The other thing that I have to get them ready is resources. So, for example, I mean, we discussed when I was still on active duty, I don't know whether they've talked about it lately, but one of the ways you helped reduce stress on the active component force was by using Guard and Reserve forces for known deployments where otherwise we could have used an AC unit. One was available. You have to worry because we can only use the Army Reserve and the Army Guard so many times for a variety of reasons. And unless that money was specifically put into the OCO budget, that's coming out of some other cost in the Army to pay that 400 days of active duty time for that unit. But if you absolutely have to preserve some AC unit for 24-hour response, and they're the last ones you have available to go to a named unit, to go to a named operation, and you've got the time required to get that RC unit ready, you can do that. So there's trades both in peacetime, and then in wartime, I talked about using the C rating as a start point for discussion, not an end point for a discussion. So again, if, for example, I know that there's a high priority capability in the theater support or theater opening package that's in their RC, and maybe the training model from First Army says I need 45 days to get it ready, or 30 days to get it ready, or 15 days to get it ready, and the COCOM really wants it in 10, but I know it's going to stay in the port, in a secured area, and doing just this mission for the first 30 days, maybe I can take some risk and deploy it at a lower level of readiness. Maybe I can choose which tasks I actually have to train it on, get it deployed, and then retrain it before I allow it out of that secured area and further on into the movement pipeline. But if you take C rating as a start point for discussion, not an end point of a discussion, you can find those kind of creative uses, whether it's for an AC unit or for an RC unit. We did some work at RAND that talked a lot about how do you sequence units through General James's mobilization enterprise, and the standard answer is in accordance with the tip-fit. But it turns out that you might actually be more effective if the COCOM's tip-fit has enough flexibility within it to sequence units differently, and you'll get the right capabilities in the right place with the right training at the right time in a more effective way than just straight tip-fit based management. So some ideas that are out there, they all have strengths, they all have weaknesses, and they all have costs. So you got to balance it.
Afternoon, gentlemen. CW5 John Carmeyer, Chief of Aviation Safety for the National Guard. I wrote all this down because my head's spinning because you guys are talking a lot of cool stuff, and I really appreciate it. But going off the missile launcher metaphor, sir, being able to count them is very important. In my mind, in safety, if we can manage risk at the enterprise level, and if the 3- and 4-star level knows that X is a problem, whatever hazard it is, and we do a big buy, we get economies of scale. That's the first takeaway for me. If in an enterprise IT solution being conducted in real time for USR, imagine if the Readiness NCO or whatever level you're putting the data in is available to you guys at the top level. You can actually plug in assets. COCOM commanders can do their thing and predict assets needed in real time, and resources can be projected or reallocated in real time based on real need versus, oh, we wish, or if only. That's all I have. Thanks.
I will say, and this may not be part of your question, but USR analysis is mostly driving by looking in the rear view mirror. And so you're driving based on what units reported to you 30 or 60 days ago. And at least when I was on the Army staff, we had no real predictive readiness. So we couldn't tell you where, 3rd Brigade 82nd Airborne was going to be in 6 months or something like that, because our systems could not look out. And I think, as you talked about enterprise IT, that capability is probably starting to come into grasp of the Army, where you can see the personnel status and the equipment status 6, maybe even a year out. I don't know. And maybe, Charlie, I don't know if we've made any progress.
Yeah, we have some, but we got work to do. I mean, there's a lot there, but it's a systems architecture, data merge that's got to happen. So we're not there yet, but Secretary talked about it this morning. I can tell you that we're working on it. It's going to take time. It's not, and then more complicated is it's not necessarily an apples compo 1, oranges compo 2. I mean, it's a different look. So we've got to be careful. I think the Department of Defense is having, trying to wrap their arms around it, because that predictive tool would be very helpful for commanders. So we're working it.
Yes, sir. To follow that up, just from my perspective, if it's automatic, the data, everybody loves data calls, right? Hey, we need. We spend more time ginning up slides and presentations as opposed to the boss going in and saying, this is what I can see. Sure. And if I don't understand it, explain it to me in real time. Therefore, you eliminate the workflow product, and the end user, you all at the 4-star level and the OSD level, can make predictions.
Sir, please.
First of all, thank you for the excellent panel on your insight and the perspective. This is Charles Brown on CCDC, U.S. Army Research Laboratory. The question for you is, the United States is the world leader today, and our mission is to keep the world in peace and in order, so that the people in the world can advance our civilization to the next stage. And I wonder how this mission or this ultimate goal or objective can be connected to the strategic readiness of the U.S. Army, and then how we define our readiness in order to accomplish our ultimate objective.
I'll start from a theater perspective. A fundamental aspect of our mission is deterrence, and deterrence is created by readiness at all three echelons. So I think this is fundamental to keeping a peaceful world.
I guess I touched on a little bit in my comments. I think that forces forward in theaters that are out operating are they're enabling access. Their presence is felt in the region, and that combination provides a degree of influence that, absent U.S. leadership and absent sort of international or coalition unity, there would be challenges greater than I think that we have today. So I think that, again, back to the Defender series and all the joint exercises that we support across the globe with the combatant commanders and the ongoing current operations that have U.S. forces involved enable all of that. And that I think that it matters that the U.S. is there in conducting missions on behalf of not just the countries that we're operating with, but our commanders that are forward in theater.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for your answers. And my next question is that can we, I wonder if by reflection on the thinking about the recent two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, if we can turn back the clock in terms of Army's strategic planning, can we get a better outcome compared with the reality? Or in another word, can we do better by rethinking or learning about what we have learned?
I'll take a crack at one aspect, and that is mobilization. And I think we struggled at the start, I want to say 2004, 2005, thinking about power projection platforms, getting reserve component units through these mobilization sites. I think for whatever reason, we had lost those skills, and so we had to kind of regenerate all those, and it was painful. And so thinking about that, I think in the future we can do a better job with that by anticipating, tasking. It just seemed like we were learning it from scratch at the time when I was trying to equip that force. I know others were trying to train it. It just seemed very harder than it needed to be at the time.
Okay, and how do we apply the deterrence in that situation?
I think deterrence is a function of your adversary's perception and how it affects his decision-making process. And that perception is in part a function of the activities that we take. And one of those fundamental activities is to be prepared.
Okay, so thank you.
Otto Grosh with Sea Power Magazine. You've talked a lot here, and the Secretary this morning, strategic readiness basically is how to get the Army to where it needs to be for the fight. A major way you get most of your heavy forces is sea lift. The MARAD and the Military Sea Lift Command are in pretty sad shape right now. MARAD's got some of the oldest ships, and still sailing the planet. And they just did a stress test of them, and they're still struggling with the figures about how many ships they could actually get mobilized, because it's not only condition of the ships, it's the lack of trained mariners, civilian mariners, who are qualified to go on those ships. A major movement, of your forces requires sea lift, and the question is, are your exercises going to stress that sea lift capability, to see whether the Navy can support you in that part of the mission?
So I think there's some really good studies going on right now that the Department of Defense are looking into. I think that I would not underestimate Transcom. So yes, while there are some challenges with some of those, and I'm a little out of school on this one, but I just can give you some thoughts on what's actually underway. But I would not underestimate Transcom. So I think we can move. In fact, I know we can move. Yes, sir.
Sir.
Gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Paul Tennant. I'm the British military attaché here in DC. I just like to ask for comment really on a specific element to the global operating model. As you know, the GOM is broken down into 4 different layers: the contact, the blunt, the surge, and the homeland. The layer that really interests me in the scope of this panel is the blunt layer, which, just by way of a reminder, is subdefined into delay, degrade, or deny adversary aggression. To me, that represents a new, or if not totally new, mostly new challenge to readiness planning, and I'd be really interested in how you anticipate addressing the readiness challenge within that layer.
Could you say your name again, please? No, I'm just teasing, Paul. Nice to see you. Nobody recognizes Paul in the room. Yeah, so, Paul, that's exactly the question about where things are positioned and what state of readiness they're in, right? So, and depending on which theater you're talking about, in my personal case, the European theater, it depends which things are pre-positioned, which things are assigned and present, and which things can move how fast from a standing start of what level of readiness. So it touches everything that both Tom and Mike talked about in terms of calibrating how much readiness does a force need. We've worked those, the math on those very hard for the European theater, and it's the sweet spot that we're trying to achieve. Obviously, exactly where we see that sweet spot isn't something we'd discuss in a large forum like this. But that sweet spot is exactly what we need to achieve. In the case of the European theater, it's critical to understand that the best way to close the time-distance gaps is to do things as an alliance or as a large multilateral force pre-Article 5 if necessary. So we return again to strategic, tactical, and operational interoperability. Our ability to be ready to work together as one of the fundamental conditions of readiness at each of those echelons is fundamental to our ability to get to have a blunt layer that can achieve the objectives of the blunt layer.
My name is Cornel Lathra-Barathim. I'm the Spanish military attaché here in DC. And I continue with the last question and with your comments, sir, with your answer. Some interoperability is one of these key elements, specifically working in a coalition, and particularly when the coalition is a coalition of the willing, led by the U.S. Sometimes, no matter how much interoperable we are in terms of systems or units, sometimes the flow of information, because of the strict regulations, because of the security classification, is really hampering even the mission. Sometimes it's really hard to get information, the necessary information in time. So taking this into account with the new idea of this cloud Jedi enterprise that will require the tremendous flow of information. Do you think it is necessary to work on this, to try to solve this flow of information regarding partners and allies? Is there any initiative on that regard? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, I favor the discussion of interoperability that we find in the AJP on interoperability, the Allied Joint Publication, which says that interoperability is a function of three factors: human interoperability, procedural interoperability, and technical interoperability. And we can develop each of these simultaneously or alone. Each of them requires different types of activity to develop. By far, the most challenging thing is to develop pure technical interoperability at tactical echelons, because this requires a proliferation of interoperable systems across the force. Procedural things and human things, that's easy to get after. General Varela and I recently had a long discussion about the frequency of the U.S. interaction with the Spanish Army, and I think we have a way to go ahead. With regard to the technical things, we have been spending a great deal of effort to create a mission partner environment, much like the Afghan mission network, except standing. It began with an idea inside the U.S. forces in Europe, but it's spread to the Pacific and across the Army now, and there's a U.S. Army program to have an interoperable, multinational operational network. And the intention would be to conduct the vast majority of our operations and exercise information on that network. In the U.S. Army in Europe, we are migrating onto that right now so that we can be in a position to have constant communication with our allies. I do point out that each of those allies will have to take policy decisions and to make some acquisition decisions in order to be able to participate in that network. I would say the first thing is really having a space, an electronic space in which we are all comfortable operating and passing information. But your simple question was, do I think that's important? Absolutely.
I would say Defender 22 is, sort of the first at-scale deployment of the MPE environment that we've done. As Chris pointed out, we've been spending a fair amount of resources over time on it, and we're prepared to make some decisions here in the near term, given what we are seeing and what commanders are telling us. So, but I echo the human and the procedural part of it too, and recognize that not necessarily all the technical ones are going to be integrated at where everybody's happy, but we've got to find some level of some degree of comfort with those systems for us to be able to operate together.
Thank you, sir.
Let me just add, I think the Army has learned this lesson, and they are, in their new network programs like Integrated Tactical Network, starting to keep that as a requirement, that it have some interoperable capabilities versus requiring an in-theater engineering solution. And so it seems like we forget that every time, and then we have to put together something like an Afghan mission network on SIPR or something like that. At least at this point, until money becomes a problem, those programs are keeping interoperability as a requirement at this point. So maybe there's some hope in the future.
All right. Anybody else? Any other questions? All right. Gents, thank you so much. This is a fantastic panel. Turn it over soon. Thank you so much. Turn it over to Honorable Murphy real quick.
Mike, good to see you again. I'm always amazed at how succinctly you put that.
There's the
It's very useful.
token of appreciation.
I think we got it.
You got him? Okay. All right. Then we're good. We're good.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, I got a little nervous there. You look, I knew your name. You look exactly like General Funk from the side. I was like, so that's like I
Starts with the same last.
Yes, no, but from the side. That's why I stumbled. I just didn't really think. I was like, I just saw you a second ago, and I'm like, I was like, when did he get on? And I looked at my sheet like, so, you might great job. So thank you very much. You guys take care. Thank you so much.
Sir, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know what I can do for Heritage, but if I can, let me know. Okay, sounds good. Sir, thank you so much. Thank you for all the help. Let us go out.
Did you guys update your comments at all?
Maybe a couple sentences.
Okay, yeah. Nothing.
sir. It was really good. I appreciate it.
Did you hear anything in there you didn't like?
No.
Okay, good.
Yes, sir. I just want to make sure I got the final.
Well, do you want the final?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, because they're just good. I mean, because we really are having a hard conversation on this. So.
All right, I'll send it to you.
Yes, sir. Anything you need from us?
No, I think we're in great shape. I really appreciate all the coordination and stuff like that. It's great.
Good. Wonderful. We really appreciate it.
Hey, good to see you. Hey, Butch.